July 19, 1940. 08:20 hours. Mediterranean Sea north of Crete. Captain John Collins felt his stomach drop. 2 Italian cruisers on the horizon. The lookout had just confirmed it. Bartolomeo Colleoni and Giovanni delle Bande Nere, the fastest warships in the entire world.
Keep 'em coming!
Collins gripped the bridge railing. His knuckles went white. Here's what you need to understand. It's been 8 months since World War II started. 8 months of submarines torpedoing merchant ships. 8 months of aircraft dropping bombs. 8 months of mines blowing holes in hulls. But ship-to-ship combat, cruiser against cruiser, gun against gun, not a single kill. 0. Nobody had managed to sink an enemy cruiser using gunfire alone, and now Collins was staring at 2 of them. His ship could do 32 knots. The Italians, they touched 40 knots during trials. Do the math. If they want to run, he cannot catch them. If they want to fight and escape, he has no answer. Every tactical manual said the same thing. Shadow them, report their position, wait for reinforcements. Collins had 90 minutes to make a decision that would change naval warfare forever. 1 Australian cruiser, 2 Italian warships, and 645 men whose lives depended on what he did next. Sir, Lieutenant Commander Ninnis was waiting. Your orders. Collins turned from the railing. His gunnery officer stood at attention, binoculars hanging from his neck. Behind him the bridge crew had frozen, every man watching, every man waiting. Range, Collins asked. 23,000 yards, sir, roughly 10 miles. That's the edge of our effective range. Yes, sir, and they're faster than us. Significantly faster. Collins knew what Ninnis was thinking. What every man on that bridge was thinking. This fight made no sense. The geometry was wrong. The Italians held every advantage. He walked to the chart table, studied the coastline of Crete. The Italian cruisers were sailing southwest toward open water, but they weren't in open water yet. The coast constrained their movement, limited their options. They can't run northwest without exposing their broadsides, Collins said quietly, almost to himself. Ninnis stepped closer. Sir, look at their position, number 1. They're boxed in. If we get between them and their escape route south, their speed advantage means nothing. That's not standard doctrine, sir. Collins looked up, met his officer's eyes. Standard doctrine says we can't win this fight. Do you want to follow standard doctrine, or do you want to sink an Italian cruiser? Ninnis swallowed hard. What are your orders, Captain? Collins straightened. His voice carried across the entire bridge. Battle stations. All hands to action stations. Raise battle ensigns. The bridge exploded into motion. Below decks, the alarm tore through the ship like an electric shock. Men threw down coffee cups, abandoned card games, scrambled from bunks. Boots thundered on steel ladders, bodies squeezed through narrow passageways. In the forward turret, Petty Officer William Harris heard the alarm and felt his heart slam against his ribs. 23 years old, son of a Melbourne dockworker. He'd never fired a shot in combat. Move, move, move! Chief Gunner's Mate Patterson was screaming. Get those shells ready. This isn't a bloody drill. Harris grabbed a 112-pound shell. His arms burned. His breath came fast. Who are we fighting? Someone shouted. Italians, 2 cruisers, fast ones. Harris felt his stomach clench. Everyone knew about Italian cruisers. Everyone knew they were faster than anything in the Australian fleet. Can we catch them? He asked. Patterson's face was grim. Captain's got a plan. That's all you need to know. Now load. 0829 hours. Collins stood at the bridge window. The Italian cruisers were running southwest smoke pouring from their funnels. They knew Sydney was coming. They knew they were faster. They were wrong about what that meant. Forward turrets ready, sir, Ninnis reported. A and B turrets report all guns loaded. Collins nodded. His mouth was dry. His palms were wet. 20,000 yards. roughly 30 seconds for a shell to reach its target. At that range, gunnery was as much art as science. Wind, temperature, the target's movement. 1,000 variables that had to be calculated perfectly. And even then, most shots would miss. But Collins had spent his entire career preparing for this moment. Every drill, every exercise, every late night studying fire control manuals. It all came down to this. "Director Control Tower," he said into the voice pipe. "You have the solution?" Lieutenant Peters' voice crackled back. "Solution calculated, sir. Ready to fire." Collins took a breath. "All forward turrets, commence firing." The world erupted. A and B turrets fired simultaneously. The ship shuddered. 4 6-inch shells screamed toward the Mediterranean sky. Harris felt the deck jump beneath his feet. His ears rang despite the sound-dampening gear. "Reload! Reload!" He grabbed another shell, rammed it into the breach. The gun captain yanked the firing lever. Another explosion. Another shell arcing toward the enemy. In the director control tower, Peters tracked the fall of shot through his rangefinder. Splashes appeared in the water. Short. The shells had fallen ahead of the Italian ships. Up 400 right, 2 degrees. The calculations adjusted. The guns fired again. More splashes. Closer now. The Italians were weaving, throwing off Sydney's aim. Smoke screens billowed behind them. "They're running," Ninnis observed. "Of course they're running," Collins replied. "But look at where they're running to." Ninnis studied the chart. His eyes widened. The Italians were heading toward the coast of Crete. Every evasive maneuver was pushing them closer to land. Their options were shrinking. "You planned this," Ninnis said. "You knew they'd run this direction." Collins allowed himself a small smile. "I hoped." 08:35 hours. Peter's voice exploded through the voice pipe. "Hit! We have a hit on Bonde Nere, confirmed hit." The bridge erupted in cheers. Collins raised a hand for silence. "Keep firing. Don't let up." In the forward turret, Harris was moving on pure instinct now. Grab shell, load, fire, grab shell, load, fire. His arms screamed. Sweat poured down his face. The air was thick with cordite smoke. "Another hit!" someone shouted. "Colleoni this time!" The Italians were firing back. Harris heard the whistle of incoming shells. Saw splashes in the water around Sydney. Too close. Much too close. But Sydney's gunners were finding their rhythm now. Shell after shell left the barrels. The guns recoiled. Breaches opened. Empty casings ejected. Fresh rounds rammed home. 8 rounds per minute per gun. That's what the manual said. Yeah. Harris and his crew were exceeding that. Adrenaline made the impossible possible. 08:47 hours. Collins watched the Italian cruisers through his binoculars. They were still running, still weaving. But they were taking hits now. Smoke was rising from Colleoni's superstructure. "Sir, ammunition report from the magazines." Ninnis looked worried. "We're burning through shells at an incredible rate." "How many rounds expended?" "Over 300, sir. At this rate, we'll be empty in 40 minutes. Collins nodded. He'd calculated this too. "Then we have 40 minutes to finish this." In the aft magazine, able seaman Thomas Clark was part of the human chain, passing shells hand to hand through narrow passageways. The temperature had climbed past 100 degrees. Men were stripping off shirts, gasping for air. "Keep moving," the chief shouted. "The guns need feeding." Clark's shoulders ached. His hands were raw, but he kept passing shells, one after another, each one weighing 112 pounds. Each one a potential killing blow against the enemy. He was 19 years old. He'd joined Sydney just 2 months ago. He had no idea that 16 months from now, he would be among the 645 men who would disappear when Sydney met a very different enemy. But today, he was part of something extraordinary. 09:23 hours. Peters's voice came through the voice pipe higher than before, almost cracking. Critical hit, engine room. Colleone's engine room. Collins leaned forward. Through his binoculars he saw it. Colleone was slowing, her speed dropping. 25 knots. 20. 15. She's losing way, sir. Ninny's was grinning now. Her rudder's jammed. She can't maneuver. The fastest cruiser in the world was dying. Collins felt something break loose in his chest. Relief. Triumph. The absolute validation of everything he'd believed. Signal Hyperion and Ilex, he ordered. Finish her with torpedoes. We're going after Bonde Nere. But Bonde Nere was pulling away. Her captain had seen Colleone's fate. He was running at maximum speed now, desperate to escape. Sydney gave chase, her guns still firing, her crew still loading. But the range was opening. 22,000 yards. 24,000. 28,000. 09:32 hours. Collins made the hardest decision of the battle. Cease fire. The guns fell silent. The sudden quiet was almost painful. Sir, Harris called up from the forward turret. We can still hit them. Check your ammunition, Collins replied. How many rounds remaining? Silence. Then Patterson's voice subdued. 10 rounds, sir. Maybe 12. 10 rounds. Out of nearly 1,000 they'd started with. Collins had pushed his ship to the absolute limit, and it had been enough. 09:59 hours. Hyperion and Ilex closed on the crippled Colleone. The Italian cruiser fought back with her secondary guns, fierce, defiant, hopeless. 3 torpedoes hit below the waterline. Collins watched through his binoculars as Colleone's bow section disintegrated. The ship listed, capsized, sank. The fastest cruiser in the world disappeared beneath the Mediterranean. Behind him, someone was crying. Someone else was laughing. Most of the bridge crew just stood in stunned silence. Sir? Ninnis's voice was hoarse. Casualty report from the medical officer. Collins braced himself. 1 wounded, sir. Able Seaman Thompson. Shrapnel from that hit to our forward funnel. Minor injuries. He'll be fine. 1 casualty. 1 man wounded against 2 Italian cruisers. Collins closed his eyes, let out a breath he'd been holding for 90 minutes. Number 1, he said quietly. Set course for the survivors. We're picking them up. The Italians, sir. They're sailors. They're in the water. We're picking them up. Within hours, 555 Italian sailors were pulled from the Mediterranean, rescued by the men who had just sunk their ship. That was the kind of captain John Collins was. But Sydney's story wasn't over, not even close. When she steamed into Alexandria harbor the next day, the entire Mediterranean fleet was waiting. Every ship manned the rails. Crews lined the decks. They cheered as Sydney passed. Flags dipped in salute. Admiral Cunningham himself came aboard. Captain Collins, he said, shaking the Australian's hand. You've achieved a victory over a superior force, the first cruiser sunk by gunfire since the war began. Collins nodded, exhausted, elated, still processing what his crew had accomplished. He didn't know that 16 months later, Sydney would meet a disguised German raider off the coast of Western Australia. He didn't know that the lessons of Cape Spada would be useless at point-blank range. He didn't know that all 645 of his men would vanish without a single survivor. He only knew that on July 19, 1940, an Australian cruiser had done the impossible. And in Part 2, we'll see how this victory changed everything, how it shattered Italian confidence, how it proved that speed wasn't everything, and how the tactics Collins pioneered became required study in every naval college in the world. But we'll also meet the men who didn't come home. The 645 souls who would disappear 16 months later. And we'll ask the question that still haunts Australian naval history. How did the ship that achieved perfection at Cape Spada make such a fatal mistake off Western Australia, July 20th, 1940? 0800 hours. Alexandria Harbor, Egypt. 24 hours ago, Captain John Collins did the impossible. His crew sank the fastest cruiser in the world. One casualty. One shell hole in the funnel. 90 minutes of perfect gunnery against 2 enemy warships. But here's what nobody tells you about military victories. The battle is the easy part. Collins stood on Sydney's bridge as she entered Alexandria Harbor. His uniform was still stained with sweat and cordite. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. His hands trembled slightly from the adrenaline that hadn't fully left his system. And then he saw them. Every ship in the Mediterranean fleet was waiting. Battleships, destroyers, minesweepers. Hundreds of vessels, all with crews lining the rails. Flags dipping in salute. The cheering started before Sydney even reached her berth. It rolled across the harbor like thunder. Men waving, horns blaring. A sound that Collins would remember for the rest of his life. "Sir." Ninnies appeared beside him. "Signal from the flagship. Admiral Cunningham requests your presence immediately upon docking." Collins nodded. He knew what was coming. Congratulations. Handshakes. The official recognition of what Sydney had achieved. What he didn't know was that the real battle was just beginning. And this one would be fought not with guns, but with politics, doubt, and the crushing weight of military bureaucracy. Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham's office aboard HMS Warspite was impressive. Oak paneling, naval maps covering every wall, the smell of pipe tobacco and authority. Collins stood at attention while Cunningham read his after-action report. The Admiral's face was unreadable. Minutes passed. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Finally, Cunningham looked up. "Captain Collins, you expended 956 rounds of 6-inch ammunition in 90 minutes. "Yes, sir." "That's nearly your entire magazine." "Yes, sir." Cunningham set down the report. "You engaged 2 faster enemy cruisers at maximum range with no guarantee of success, and burned through ammunition at a rate that would have left you defenseless if you'd encountered additional threats." Collins felt his jaw tighten. "Sir, the tactical situation was brilliant." Cunningham's face broke into a smile. "Absolutely brilliant. You constrained their maneuver options using geography-maintained volume of fire until you achieved critical hits and sank one of Mussolini's prized cruisers without losing a single man." Collins exhaled. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet, Captain." Cunningham stood, walked to the window, stared out at the harbor. "What you did at Cape Spada, it changes things. Do you understand that?" "Sir, for 8 months, everyone has assumed surface warfare is dead. Submarines, aircraft, that's the future, they say. Cruiser combat is obsolete." Cunningham turned back to face Collins. "You just proved them wrong, and now everyone from London to Canberra wants to know how." Collins frowned. "I'm not sure I understand the problem, sir." "The problem, Captain, is that your tactics only worked because of your specific training, your gunnery background, your crew's discipline, your fire control systems." Cunningham's voice hardened. "The Admiralty wants to know if this can be replicated, if other captains can achieve what you achieved, and frankly, I'm not sure they can." There it was, the doubt. Even after victory. Collins stepped forward. "Sir, with respect, I believe the principles can be taught. Long-range engagement, sustained volume of fire, tactical positioning to constrain faster enemies. These aren't secrets. They're fundamentals that have been forgotten in the rush toward new technologies." Cunningham raised an eyebrow. "Forgotten. That's a bold claim." "It's the truth, sir. I've seen it throughout the fleet. Gunnery training has been reduced. Fire control drills are treated as formalities. Everyone assumes the next war will be won by aircraft carriers and submarines." Collins's voice grew passionate. "But what happens when the carrier is out of range? When the submarines can't intercept surface combat still matters, sir. Cape Spada proved it." Cunningham was silent for a long moment. "You want to teach this?" he said finally. "Train other crews." "I want to prove it wasn't luck," Collins replied. "I want to prove that any Australian ship, any Commonwealth cruiser can achieve what Sydney achieved, given proper training." Cunningham walked back to his desk, sat down, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. "I'm going to recommend something to the Admiralty," he said. "Something that will either make your career or destroy it. Are you prepared for that?" Collins didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir." "Very well." Cunningham began writing. "Sydney will remain in the Mediterranean for extended operations. You will document your tactics, your training methods, everything that contributed to your success, and you will demonstrate them in combat." "Demonstrate them, sir." Cunningham looked up. His eyes were hard. "The Italians are still out there, Captain. Banda Nere escaped, and there are more cruisers in their fleet. Faster ones, better armed ones." He set down his pen. "If Cape Spada was a fluke, we'll know soon enough. If it wasn't, then you'll have done more for Commonwealth naval doctrine than 100 training manuals." Collins felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about Sydney anymore. It was about proving a concept, validating a doctrine. And if he failed, if his next engagement went badly... "When do we begin, sir?" Cunningham smiled grimly. "You already have. Sydney sorties in 48 hours. Italian convoy spotted heading for Libya. You're going to intercept." Collins saluted, turned to leave. "Captain," Cunningham's voice stopped him at the door. "The men you pulled from the water, the Italian survivors. That was well done." "They were sailors, sir. We couldn't leave them." "No, we couldn't." Cunningham nodded slowly. "Don't forget that, Collins. In all the killing, don't forget that." Collins thought about those words often in the months that followed. July 22, 1940. Sydney's wardroom. Lieutenant Commander Ninny spread the charts across the table. The ship's senior officers gathered around. Outside, the Mediterranean sun beat down on the deck, but inside the wardroom, the atmosphere was tense. "Italian convoy," Ninny said. 6 merchant ships, escort of 2 destroyers, heading from Naples to Tripoli. "Destroyers only?" Lieutenant Peters asked. He was the gunnery officer, the man who had calculated every firing solution at Cape Spada. "No cruiser escort." "None spotted, but that doesn't mean they're not out there." Collins studied the chart. The convoy route passed through open water. No geographic constraints this time. No way to box in a faster enemy. "If cruisers appear, we'll be outpaced again," Ninny's observed. "Then we hit them before they can react," Collins replied. "Maximum range, maximum volume. Don't give them time to think." Peters shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, about the ammunition situation." "I know." Collins' voice was quiet. "We expended nearly everything at Cape Spada. Resupply is limited. We're going into this fight with 60% of our normal loadout." Silence around the table. 60%, Ninny's repeated. "That's not much margin for error." "Then we don't make errors." Collins looked at each of his officers in turn. "Gentlemen, the Admiral has made his expectations clear. Sydney is to demonstrate that Cape Spada wasn't a fluke, that our tactics work, that surface gunnery still matters in this war." "And if we encounter superior forces?" Peters asked. "We engage. We inflict maximum damage, and we prove our point." Collins's jaw set. "I won't lie to you. The next few months will be dangerous. We're being asked to validate a doctrine that the Admiralty isn't sure about. If we succeed, other crews will be trained our way. If we fail..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "There's something else you should know," Ninny said quietly. "The Italians have been reinforcing their Mediterranean fleet. After Cape Spada, Mussolini is furious. He's ordered his cruisers to hunt us specifically." "Good." Collins smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Let them come." July 25, 1940. 06:30 hours. Open Mediterranean. Sydney found the convoy at dawn. 6 merchant ships plodding toward Libya. 2 destroyers flanking them. No cruisers in sight. "Battle stations," Collins ordered. His voice was calm, almost casual. Below decks, the familiar chaos erupted. Men running, shells being loaded, gun crews taking their positions. Harris was back in the forward turret. His arm still ached from Cape Spada. His dreams were still filled with the thunder of guns and the screams of orders. But when the alarm sounded, his body moved without thought. "Range!" Patterson shouted. 18,000 yards to lead destroyer. Commence firing." The guns roared. This engagement was different from Cape Spada, shorter, more brutal. The Italian destroyers never stood a chance. They were outgunned, outranged, and outmaneuvered. Sydney's shells tore through them in minutes. The first destroyer took 3 hits and exploded. The second tried to flee, was hit twice in the engine room and drifted to a stop. The merchant ships scattered, but they were slow, fat, easy targets. Within 2 hours, the convoy ceased to exist. Collins watched the last merchant ship go down. Oil spreading across the water. Debris floating on the swells. "Survivors in the water, sir," Ninnies reported. "Pick them up. All of them." Sydney rescued 87 Italian sailors that day, added to the 555 from Cape Spada. Collins was building a reputation not just as a deadly commander, but as a humane one, the Admiralty noticed. August 3, 1940, Alexandria. The message from London arrived at sunset. Collins read it 3 times before he believed it. "Sir, Ninnis was waiting. Good news or bad?" Collins handed him the message, watched his number one's eyes widen. "They're adopting your training doctrine," Ninnies breathed. "Fleet-wide, every cruiser in the Mediterranean." Not just the Mediterranean. Collins took back the message. The Pacific Fleet, too. The home fleet. Every Commonwealth cruiser captain is being ordered to implement long-range gunnery drills according to Sydney's methods. Ninnis sat down heavily. "We did it. Cape Spada actually changed things." "It changed everything, number one." Collins walked to the porthole, stared out at the darkening harbor. "The old ways still work. Speed isn't everything, and now the entire fleet will know it. The men will want to celebrate." Collins nodded. "Let them. They've earned it." But even as he said the words, something cold settled in his stomach. A premonition he couldn't explain. Sydney had become famous. The cruiser that proved surface warfare still mattered. The ship that took on faster enemies and won. Newspapers across the Allied world carried her name. Newsreels showed her footage. Radio broadcasts told her story. And somewhere in a German naval command center, men were studying that story very carefully. Men who commanded disguised raiders. Armed merchant ships that looked like civilian vessels. Ships designed to get close before revealing their weapons. Collins didn't know about HSK Cormoran yet. Didn't know about her concealed 5.9-inch guns, her torpedoes, her deadly close-range armament. Didn't know that everything Sydney had learned at Cape Spada, long-range engagement fire control, superiority, tactical positioning, would be useless when an enemy got within 2,000 yards before showing its true colors. The tactics that made Sydney legendary required one thing above all: distance. And Cormoran was designed to eliminate that distance before the battle even began. September 1940. Mediterranean operations. Sydney continued her reign. The bombardment of Bardia on September 17th. The first British warship to attack an Italian colony. Shells raining down on enemy positions while Italian coastal batteries fired back helplessly. The patrol actions, the convoy escorts, the constant presence that kept Italian surface forces bottled up in their ports. Collins drove his crew hard. Gunnery drills every day, fire control exercises every night. He was determined to maintain the edge that had won at Cape Spada. "The men are exhausted, sir," Ninnies warned one evening. "The men are prepared," Collins replied. "There's a difference." But even he could see the toll. 7 months of continuous operations, combat actions, rescues, patrols. Sydney's crew was running on fumes and pride. In November, The orders finally came. Sydney was going home. November 20th, 1940. Port Said. Collins assembled the crew on deck. "Gentlemen," he said, "we've received orders to return to Australia for refit and crew rotation. We depart in 2 days." The cheer was deafening, men hugging, tears flowing. After everything they'd been through, they were going home. Collins let them celebrate, but he pulled Ninnis aside. "I won't be coming back," he said quietly. Ninnis stared at him. "Sir." "Promotion. Transfer to Singapore as Assistant Chief of Staff." Collins's voice was neutral, professional, but Ninnis could hear the regret beneath it. "Sydney will have a new captain when she returns to operations." "Who?" "Captain Joseph Burnett. Good man. Experienced officer." Ninnis was silent for a moment. "It won't be the same, sir." "Nothing ever is, number one. Nothing ever is." January 1941. Sydney Harbour, Australia. Sydney came home to a hero's welcome. Thousands lined the harbour. Ferries and small craft filled the water. Horns and sirens created a wall of sound. As Sydney passed Bradley's Head, where the mast of the original HMAS Sydney stood as a memorial, the Commonwealth flag was lowered in tribute. Sydney, too, dipped her ensign in return. The Governor-General attended, the Minister for the Navy, admirals and dignitaries, and press photographers. Collins stood on the bridge and watched his city celebrate. These were his people, his country, and they were cheering for what he and his crew had accomplished. At the Sydney Town Hall ceremony, they presented medals, silver medallions struck by the jeweler W.J. Amor. One side showed Sydney and battle guns firing Corleone burning on the horizon. The reverse bore an inscription commemorating their victory. Collins received his medallion, shook hands with the Lord Mayor, posed for photographs, and then quietly he said goodbye. Most of the crew wouldn't return to Sydney. Of the 614 men who had fought at Cape Spada, only 252 would rejoin the ship. The rest were transferred elsewhere. New faces, new officers, a new captain, a new Sydney. Collins never forgot the men who served with him, the gunnery crews who had maintained that impossible rate of fire, the ammunition handlers who had passed shells hand to hand in 100-degree heat, the officers who had trusted his unconventional tactics. He never forgot the 555 Italian sailors they had pulled from the water, the humanity they had maintained even in the midst of killing. And he never forgot the lessons of Cape Spada, the principles that had been adopted fleet-wide, the doctrine that bore his mark: long-range engagement, sustained volume of fire, tactical positioning to constrain faster enemies. But there was one lesson Collins had learned that couldn't be written in any manual. One truth that would haunt him when the news came from Western Australia 16 months later. The best tactics in the world are worthless if your enemy doesn't let you use them. And somewhere in the Indian Ocean, a German captain named Theodor Detmers was already planning how to ensure that Sydney never got the chance. Part 3. Preview. When Sydney sailed again in 1941, she was a different ship, different crew, different captain, but the same reputation, the same legend. Captain Joseph Burnett knew the stories, knew the expectations, knew that every enemy vessel in every ocean had heard about the Australian cruiser that had done the impossible. What he didn't know was that being famous could be a curse as well as a blessing. Because when you're legendary, your enemies study you. They analyze your tactics, they find your weaknesses, and they design ships specifically to exploit them. In Part 3, we'll meet HSK Cormoran, the disguised raider that looked like a Dutch merchant ship, the wolf in sheep's clothing that carried enough firepower to destroy a cruiser at point-blank range. We'll see how Burnett encountered that ship on November 19, 1941, how he made a decision that contradicted everything Collins had taught, and we'll witness the 30-minute battle that ended with 645 men vanishing without a single survivor. The story of HMAS Sydney is half glory, half tragedy. You've seen the glory. November 19, 1941. 1600 hours. Indian Ocean, off Western Australia. 16 months ago, Captain John Collins proved that an Australian cruiser could sink the fastest warship in the world. His tactics became legend. Long-range engagement, sustained volume of fire, never let a faster enemy close the distance. The entire Commonwealth fleet adopted his methods. Sydney became the most famous warship in Australian history. But here's what Collins never taught, what no one ever considered. What happens when the enemy doesn't look like an enemy? What happens when a wolf disguises itself as a sheep? Captain Joseph Burnett was about to find out, and the answer would cost 645 men their lives. Every single one of them. The German response. When news of Cape Spada reached Berlin, German naval intelligence took notice. An Australian cruiser had destroyed an Italian cruiser using superior gunnery at maximum range. The victory demonstrated that well-trained crews could defeat faster opponents through tactical positioning and sustained fire. Admiral Karl Dönitz studied the reports carefully. So did the commanders of Germany's auxiliary cruiser program. They saw a vulnerability that the Australians hadn't considered. Sydney's tactics depended on one critical factor, identifying the enemy at distance. Collins had engaged the Italians at 20,000 yards. His fire control systems needed that range to work effectively. His gunnery superiority meant nothing at close quarters. The Germans asked a simple question. What if we don't let them know we're the enemy until it's too late? HSK Cormoran was the answer. She looked like the Dutch merchant vessel Straat Malacca. 8. 736 tons. Civilian paint scheme. Cargo ship silhouette. Nothing threatening about her appearance. But beneath that disguise, Cormoran carried 6 5.9-inch guns. Torpedo tubes, mines, anti-aircraft weapons. A crew of 397 trained naval personnel under Commander Theodore Detmers. She was a wolf in sheep's clothing, designed specifically to get close before revealing her fangs. By November 1941, Cormoran had already sunk 11 Allied merchant ships totaling 68,274 tons. She operated in the Indian Ocean, far from the main convoy routes, picking off isolated vessels. Detmers knew about Sydney. Every German naval commander did. The Australian cruiser's reputation preceded her wherever she sailed. He also knew that reputation could be exploited. If Sydney approaches us, Detmers told his officers, she will expect us to run. That's what merchant ships do, but we won't run. We'll let her get close. Close enough that her gunnery advantage means nothing. It was a suicide mission in some ways. Cormoran couldn't survive a prolonged engagement with a proper warship, but if she could get within 2,000 yards before opening fire. At that range, both ships would destroy each other, and Detmers was prepared to accept those odds. The new Sydney, HMAS. Sydney, in November 1941, was not the same ship that had fought at Cape Spada. Captain Collins was gone. Promoted to Singapore. His replacement, Captain Joseph Burnett, was a competent officer, but had never commanded in combat. Of the 645 crew members aboard, only 252 were veterans of the Mediterranean campaign. The rest were new, untested. They knew Sydney's legend, but they hadn't lived it. And there was something else different. The war had changed. Japan was threatening Southeast Asia. Everyone knew conflict was coming. Sydney had spent months on convoy escort duty between Australia and Singapore. Routine patrols, boring necessary work. The crew was tired. Burnett was under pressure. The constant alerts and false alarms had dulled their edge. On November 11th, Sydney departed Fremantle, escorting the troopship Zealandia to Sunda Strait. Standard mission. No contact expected. After delivering Zealandia safely, Sydney turned back toward Fremantle. She sailed alone along the Western Australian coast. Burnett had no reason to expect trouble. 1600 hours. First contact. Lookout reports a vessel on the horizon. Burnett raises his binoculars. A merchant ship. Dutch markings. Nothing unusual for these waters. Standard procedure required verification. Approach the vessel. Check papers. Confirm identity. Collins would have kept his distance. Would have signaled from maximum range. Would have waited for a response before closing. But Collins had fought 2 enemy cruisers at Cape Spada. Fast warships that announced themselves as threats immediately. This was just a freighter. Burnett ordered Sydney to close for inspection. The range dropped. 15,000 yards. 10,000 yards. 8,000 yards. Cormoran maintained course and speed. No evasive action. No suspicious behavior. Just a merchant ship plodding toward her destination. "She's not responding to signals properly, sir," the communications officer reported. "Confused responses. Says she's Strat Malacca out of Batavia." Burnett frowned. Improper signals were common among merchant vessels. Poor training, language barriers, nothing necessarily sinister. Close to verification distance. 5,000 yards. 4,000 yards. On Cormoran's bridge, Detmers watched the cruiser approach. His heart was pounding. His gun crews were hidden behind concealed panels, fingers on triggers, waiting for his command. Just a little closer. 3,000 yards. 2,000 yards. Burnett could see the merchant vessel clearly now. Dutch flag flying. Civilian crew visible on deck. Everything looked normal. "Signal them to heave to and prepare for inspection." The signal went out. On Cormoran, Detmers took a breath. Now. The battle 1700 hours. The Dutch flag drops. German naval ensign rises. Steel panels fall away from Cormoran's sides. 6 5.9-inch guns swing toward Sydney. Fire. The first salvo hits Sydney's bridge. Direct hit. Explosion tears through the command center. Captain Burnett dies instantly. So do most of the bridge officers. Sydney's forward turrets try to respond. They're too close. The fire control systems designed for 20,000-yard engagements are useless at point-blank range. Cormoran's second salvo hits the director control tower. The sophisticated gunnery equipment that had won at Cape Spada is destroyed. Sydney is blind. Shells slam into the forward turrets. A and B turrets, the same guns that had sunk Corleone, are hit repeatedly. One turret is blown completely off the ship. The Walrus seaplane on Sydney's catapult catches fire. Flames spread across the superstructure. Sydney fires back. Her 6-inch guns tear into Cormoran's hull. The disguised raider shudders under the impacts, but it's too late. A torpedo from Cormoran strikes Sydney's bow. The explosion rips a massive hole below the waterline. Water floods the forward compartments. Sydney turns sharply, passes behind Cormoran, takes more hits as she maneuvers. Both ships are burning now. Both ships are dying. But Cormoran has achieved her mission. She has destroyed the legend. The engagement lasts 30 minutes. 30 minutes of hell at point-blank range. Everything Collins had taught every lesson from Cape Spada is useless. Long-range gunnery means nothing when the first shots come from 2,000 yards. Sustained volume of fire means nothing when your fire control is destroyed in the opening seconds. Tactical positioning means nothing when your enemy looks like a friend until the moment he opens fire. Cormoran is finished. Her engine room is wrecked. Fires rage throughout the ship. Detmers orders abandon ship. But Sydney is worse. She drifts away to the southeast. Smoke pouring from multiple fires. Her main armament silent. Her superstructure shattered. German survivors in their lifeboats watch her go. They can see the glow of her fires for hours. Then, sometime during the night, HMAS Sydney sinks. All 645 men go down with her. No survivors. Here's what makes this tragedy unique in naval history. Cormoran lost 80 men, but 317 German sailors survived. They were rescued over the following days and spent the rest of the war as prisoners in Australia. Sydney lost everyone. Not a single survivor. Not a single body recovered initially. Not a single lifeboat found. 645 men. Vanished. The Germans provided the only account of what happened. For decades, Australians questioned their testimony. Conspiracy theories spread. Maybe Japanese submarines were involved. Maybe the Germans had massacred survivors. But the evidence supported the German account. Sydney had been caught at close range by a disguised enemy. Her advantages had been neutralized. Her crew never had a chance. The news reached Australia on November 30th, 1941. The nation was devastated. Just 18 months earlier, Sydney had been the symbol of Australian naval might. The cruiser that had done the impossible. The ship whose crew had marched through Martin Place to cheering crowds. Now she was gone. Every man who had sailed on her final voyage was dead. 7 days later, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The war in the Pacific began. Sydney's loss was overshadowed by larger catastrophes. But Australia never forgot. The lessons, written in blood. The battle off Western Australia taught the Royal Australian Navy lessons that no training exercise ever could. First, reputation is not protection. Sydney's legend may have actually contributed to her destruction. Her crew had heard so many stories about their ship's invincibility that they may have underestimated the danger of approaching an unidentified vessel. Second, distance is everything. Collins had kept his enemies at 20,000 yards. Burnett closed to 2,000 yards. That single decision made all the difference. Third, disguised raiders required completely different protocols. After Sydney's loss, the RAN implemented new procedures for approaching merchant vessels: maximum caution, verification at range, never close until identity was absolutely confirmed. Fourth, no ship is unsinkable. No crew is invincible. War punishes overconfidence without mercy. The contrast between Sydney's two famous battles became required study in naval academies. At Cape Spada, Collins had exploited every advantage. Geography constrained the enemy's movement. Long range negated their speed advantage. Sustained fire achieved critical hits. Off Western Australia, Burnett had surrendered every advantage. Closing range eliminated his fire control superiority. Cormoran's disguise prevented early identification. Point-blank engagement favored the attacker. Same ship. Similar armament. Completely opposite outcomes. The difference was tactical awareness. Collins understood that his advantages only worked at distance. Burnett didn't understand that his ship's famous capabilities were useless at close range. The search for Sydney. For 66 years, HMAS Sydney's final resting place remained a mystery. The Australian government commissioned multiple searches. Technology improved decade by decade. But the Indian Ocean is vast, and the search area was enormous. Theories multiplied. Some claimed Sydney had drifted hundreds of miles before sinking. Others believed she had gone down quickly near the engagement site. Without wreckage or survivors, no one could be certain. Families of the 645 lost men waited, hoped, mourned without closure. Then in March 2008, the wreck was found. Sydney lay approximately 2,560 meters deep, roughly 207 kilometers off Steep Point. Cormoran's wreck was located about 10 kilometers away. The proximity confirmed the German accounts. Both ships had sunk relatively close to the engagement site. Underwater surveys revealed the extent of Sydney's damage. Her bow section had broken away. Her superstructure was devastated. The wreckage told the story of a ship that had absorbed tremendous punishment at close range. The discovery brought closure that families had awaited for nearly 7 decades. On November 19, 2008, exactly 67 years after the battle, a memorial service was held aboard HMAS Canberra above Sydney's wreck site. Families of the lost crew attended. Carrie Irving, daughter of a Sydney crew member, scattered her father's ashes during the ceremony. She carried one of the few surviving Amor medallions the commemorative medal struck after Cape Spada. Her father had received his at the Sydney Town Hall presentation and kept it instead of leaving it aboard for the final voyage. Most of those medallions went down with the ship, stored in the purser's office safe, a symbol of glory entombed with the men who had earned it. Collins's reaction. Captain John Collins learned of Sydney's loss while serving in Singapore. The news struck him like a physical blow. He had built that crew, trained them, led them to the most celebrated naval victory in Australian history. And now they were gone. Collins never publicly criticized Captain Burnett. He understood that armchair admirals shouldn't second-guess commanders who gave their lives in battle. But privately, those who knew him said the loss haunted him for the rest of his life. He had taught his crew to fight at distance, to use their gunnery advantage, to never let an enemy close the range. Had that lesson been forgotten? Had the new crew never understood why Collins insisted on long-range engagement? Had Burnett simply made a mistake that any captain might have made, Collins didn't know, would never know. The only witnesses were at the bottom of the Indian Ocean. He went on to become Vice Admiral Sir John Collins, Chief of Naval Staff, Australia's highest naval officer. The Collins-class submarines bear his name. But when people asked about his greatest achievement, he always spoke of Cape Spada, of those 90 minutes when everything worked perfectly, of the crew that had given him everything he asked. He rarely spoke of Sydney's end. The two battles. HMAS. Sydney's story is unique in naval history because it contains both extremes. The perfect victory at Cape Spada. Superior tactics, superior gunnery, superior judgment. One casualty against two enemy cruisers. The catastrophic defeat off Western Australia. Tactical surprise, point-blank engagement, total loss. 645 dead against a disguised merchant raider. The same ship. Similar weapons, opposite outcomes. The difference wasn't courage. Sydney's crew fought back at Western Australia. They hit Cormoran hard enough to sink her. They didn't surrender or flee. The difference was circumstances. At Cape Spada, Sydney controlled the engagement. Off Western Australia, Cormoran controlled it. In naval warfare, controlling the engagement means everything. Collins understood this instinctively. He positioned Sydney to maximize her advantages. He never let the Italians dictate the terms of battle. Burnett, approaching what appeared to be a harmless merchant ship, had no reason to think he was entering a battle at all. By the time he realized the truth, it was too late. The legacy question. So what do we learn from HMAS Sydney? That victory and defeat can come to the same ship, the same crew, the same weapons, depending entirely on tactical awareness. That reputation can breed overconfidence, that the most dangerous enemy is the one you don't recognize. All of these lessons are true, but there's something deeper. Sydney's story reminds us that war is not about ships or weapons. It's about decisions. Collins made the right decisions at Cape Spada. Burnett made the wrong ones off Western Australia. Those decisions determined who lived and who died. 645 men went to the bottom of the Indian Ocean because of a single choice. Close for inspection, standard procedure, nothing unusual. Except that the ship they were approaching was a wolf in sheep's clothing, and by the time they realized it, the battle was already lost. Part 4. Preview. In our final part, we'll explore what happened after. How Australia mourned its most famous warship. How the conspiracy theories spread and were eventually debunked. How the discovery of the wreck in 2008 brought closure to families who had waited 66 years. We'll see what became of John Collins. How he rose to command the entire Royal Australian Navy. How the lessons of Cape Spada influenced naval doctrine for generations. And we'll examine the ultimate question. Was Sydney's loss inevitable? Or could it have been prevented if someone had remembered Collins's most important lesson? Never let the enemy choose the range. The story of HMAS Sydney ends where it began, with a captain on a bridge staring at ships on the horizon making a decision that will determine the fate of everyone aboard. Collins made the right choice. Burnett made the wrong one. And 645 families paid the price. March 16, 2008. Indian Ocean. 207 kilometers off Western Australia. The sonar operator stared at his screen. After 66 years of searching there, she was. HMAS Sydney. 2 560 meters below the surface. Her hull broken. Her guns silent. Her crew entombed in the darkness of the deep. 16 months before this ship sank, Captain John Collins had achieved the impossible. He sank the fastest cruiser in the world, using nothing but gunnery skill and tactical brilliance. One casualty. One shell hole. 90 minutes of perfection. Then came the wolf in sheep's clothing. HSK Cormoran, the disguised raider that got close enough to negate every advantage Sydney possessed. 645 men lost. Not a single survivor. 2 battles. Same ship. Opposite outcomes. But what happened after? What became of the man who built Sydney's legend? What lessons did the world learn from her glory and her tragedy? This is the final chapter, the one that explains why HMAS Sydney's story still matters 85 years later. And there's a twist at the end that almost no one knows about. The admiral who never forgot John Collins didn't die with Sydney. He was in Singapore when the news came. Assistant Chief of Staff to Vice Admiral Geoffrey Layton. A desk job. Safe. Far from the ship he had commanded. When the report arrived, Collins sat alone in his office for an hour. No one disturbed him. No one knew what to say. 252 of his original crew had been aboard. Men he had trained. Men who had fought beside him at Cape Spada. Men who had maintained that impossible rate of fire while shells screamed overhead. Harris, Patterson, Clark, Peters. Gone. Collins never spoke publicly about that hour alone in his office. He was a naval officer. Professional. Controlled. He didn't display emotion. But those who knew him said something changed that day. A shadow that never quite lifted. The war continued. Singapore fell to Japan in February 1942. Collins was evacuated. He spent the rest of the war in increasingly senior positions. Commodore commanding the Australian squadron. Then Rear Admiral. When the war ended in 1945, Collins had risen to the highest ranks of the Royal Australian Navy. His career was exemplary. His reputation was sterling. In 1948, he became Chief of Naval Staff, the first graduate of the Royal Australian Naval College to hold that position. The highest-ranking naval officer in Australia. Vice Admiral Sir John Augustine Collins, knighted for his service, honored by his nation. But when journalists asked about his greatest achievement, Collins always returned to Cape Spada. Those 90 minutes, he would say. Everything worked. The crew performed beyond all expectations. We did what everyone said was impossible. He rarely mentioned Sydney's final battle. The questions were too painful. The answers too incomplete. Collins retired in 1955. He served as Australia's High Commissioner to New Zealand until 1962. He wrote his memoirs. He attended naval ceremonies. He watched a new generation of sailors learn from his victories. He died on September 3, 1989, at the age of 89. At his funeral, the Royal Australian Navy fired a 17-gun salute. The Collins-class submarines were named in his honor. The lead boat, HMAS Collins, was launched in 1993 by his widow, Lady Phyllis. John Collins achieved everything a naval officer could achieve. Rank, honors, recognition, legacy. But he carried the weight of 645 souls for the rest of his life. And the real question wasn't about his career or his honors. The real question was about the lesson he spent 50 years trying to teach, the doctrine that changed everything. After Sydney's loss, the Royal Australian Navy implemented new protocols. Never approach an unidentified vessel at close range. Verify identity from maximum distance. Assume hostility until proven otherwise. These weren't suggestions. They were absolute requirements. Collins's tactics from Cape Spada became the foundation of Australian naval doctrine. Long-range engagement, sustained volume of fire, geographic positioning to constrain faster enemies, fire control superiority. But Sydney's loss added a critical addition. Distance is survival. Close the range only when absolutely certain of the enemy's identity. The best tactics in the world are worthless if the enemy controls the engagement. This doctrine spread throughout the Commonwealth navies. The Royal Navy studied both of Sydney's battles. So did the United States Navy. So did navies around the world. The contrast was too stark to ignore. At Cape Spada, Collins engaged at 20,000 yards and achieved a perfect victory. Off Western Australia, Burnett closed to 2,000 yards and lost everything. Same ship, same armament, opposite outcomes. The lesson was clear. Naval combat is not about the ship. It's about decisions. The captain who controls the engagement wins. The captain who surrenders that control dies. During the Korean War, Commonwealth cruisers applied Sydney's lessons. They engaged shore batteries from maximum range. They never closed unless absolutely necessary. They understood that their fire control systems gave them advantages that only worked at distance. In the decades that followed, naval warfare changed dramatically. Missiles replaced guns as primary armament. Radar and satellites replaced optical rangefinders. Aircraft carriers dominated fleet actions. But the core principle remained constant. Control the engagement. Never let the enemy dictate terms. Use your advantages at the range where they matter. Collins understood this instinctively in 1940. It took his ship's destruction to teach it to everyone else. Modern Australian warships still train on these principles. The Royal Australian Navy's Doctrine Manual contains sections directly derived from Cape Spada. Collins's name appears in footnotes. His tactical decisions are analyzed in classroom exercises. 85 years later, Australian naval officers still study what went right in July 1940 and what went wrong in November 1941. They learn that reputation means nothing if you forget the principles that built it. They learn that the most dangerous enemy is the one you underestimate. They learn that 645 men died because a captain closed the range when he should have kept his distance. But the lessons of HMAS Sydney extend far beyond naval warfare. The deeper truth. What does Sydney's story really teach us? On the surface, it's about tactics, long-range gunnery, fire control, positioning, technical stuff for military historians. But underneath, it's about something more fundamental. Innovation requires courage. In 1940, conventional wisdom said Collins couldn't defeat faster enemy cruisers. The geometry was wrong. The math didn't work. Every expert would have told him to shadow the Italians and wait for reinforcements. Collins rejected conventional wisdom. He saw something others missed. He trusted his crew. He took the risk, and he achieved what no other warship had achieved since the war began. That's the pattern we see throughout military history. The ideas that change wars usually start as ideas that everyone rejects. Billy Mitchell was court-martialed for insisting that aircraft could sink battleships. He was right. The battleship admirals who mocked him were wrong. Hugh Dowding was criticized for holding back fighters during the Battle of Britain. He was right. His reserves saved England. Heinz Guderian was told that massed tank formations couldn't break through enemy lines. He was right. His tactics conquered France in 6 weeks. The military establishment resists change. This isn't stupidity. It's survival instinct. Proven tactics keep people alive. Untested theories get people killed. But sometimes the world changes faster than the establishment can adapt. Sometimes the person with the crazy idea is the only one who sees the truth. Collins saw that speed wasn't everything. That gunnery skill could defeat faster opponents. That tactics mattered more than specifications. He was right. The tragedy is that his own ship forgot his lessons 16 months later. There's something almost Greek about Sydney's story. The ship that achieved the impossible destroyed by the failure to remember what made that achievement possible. Collins spent his career emphasizing long-range engagement. Never let the enemy close. Use your advantages where they matter. Burnett closed the range, approached what looked like a harmless merchant ship, gave away every advantage Sydney possessed. The irony is crushing. But this happens more often than we like to admit. Organizations achieve success through certain principles. Then they forget those principles. They become complacent. They start believing their reputation will protect them. It never does. Success is not a permanent state. It's a continuous practice. The moment you stop doing what made you successful, you start moving toward failure. Sydney's crew had every reason to feel confident. They sailed the most famous warship in Australian history. They had heard the stories of Cape Spada countless times. They knew they served on a legend. But legends die like anyone else when they forget what made them legendary. The Discovery. For 66 years, families of Sydney's crew lived without closure. No bodies, no wreckage, no answers. Conspiracy theories spread. Some claimed Japanese submarines had participated in the attack. Others suggested Cormoran's crew had machine-gunned survivors in the water. A few believed Sydney might have drifted for days before sinking. The uncertainty was torture. Mothers died without knowing where their sons rested. Children grew old without knowing their father's final moments. Generations passed with nothing but questions. The Australian government commissioned multiple searches. Each one failed. The Indian Ocean is vast. The depths are extreme. The technology wasn't adequate. Then, in 2008, a search expedition led by the Finding Sydney Foundation made contact. The sonar images showed Sydney lying upright on the ocean floor. Her bow had broken away during the sinking. Her superstructure was devastated. The damage confirmed the German accounts. Cormoran's close-range attack had been devastating. Nearby, about 10 kilometers away, Cormoran's wreck was also located. Both ships within reach of modern technology. Both ships finally found after more than 6 decades. The Australian government held a memorial service on November 19, 2008. HMAS Canberra sailed to the site. Families of the lost crew attended. The moment was overwhelming. Carrie Irving stood at the rail. Her father had served on Sydney. He had died somewhere beneath these waters 67 years ago. She had never known him. Only stories. Only photographs. She scattered his ashes into the sea, finally giving him a resting place alongside his shipmates. She also carried something else, a silver medallion. The Amor medallion struck after Cape Spada. Her father had received his at the Sydney Town Hall ceremony in February 1941 and taken it home instead of leaving it aboard. Most of those medallions went down with Sydney, stored in the purser's safe, a commemoration of glory entombed with the men who earned it. But this one survived. A physical link between Cape Spada's triumph and the closure that came 67 years later. The detail almost no one knows. Here's something that doesn't appear in most histories of HMAS Sydney. In 2021, DNA analysis finally identified one body. A single set of remains had been recovered near Christmas Island in December 1941. For 80 years, the identity remained unknown. A sailor from Sydney, certainly, but which one? Modern forensic techniques provided the answer. Able seaman Thomas Welsby Clark. He had joined Sydney in August 1941, 3 months before her final voyage. He was one of the nearly 400 new crew members who hadn't fought at Cape Spada, who hadn't experienced the Mediterranean campaign, who knew Sydney's legend only through stories. Clark was 20 years old when he died. He never saw the Italian cruisers on the horizon, never felt the deck shudder as Sydney's guns found their targets, never experienced the perfect execution that Collins had demanded and received. He only knew the final 30 minutes, the wolf revealing its fangs, the point-blank slaughter, the fire and chaos and death. For 80 years his family had wondered. His name was listed among the lost, but there was no grave, no body, nothing to mourn over. Then finally, an answer. Thomas Welsby Clark was buried with full military honors at Geraldton War Cemetery in Western Australia in 2021. 80 years after his death. The last Sydney crew member to receive a proper burial. His family attended, 3 generations who had never met him. Finally able to say goodbye. It's a small detail in the vast tragedy of 645 lost men. One identification among hundreds still unknown. But it matters. It matters because it proves that we haven't forgotten. That Australia still cares about the sailors who gave their lives on HMAS Sydney. That even 80 years later, the work of bringing them home continues. And it matters because Thomas Clark represents all the young men who sailed on that final voyage. Men who joined a legendary ship and died before they understood what had made it legendary. The final accounting. So what does HMAS Sydney's story mean? Let's count the numbers. One final time. At Cape Spada, 956 rounds of 6-inch ammunition expended. 1 Italian cruiser sunk. 121 Italian sailors killed. 555 Italian sailors rescued. 1 Australian wounded. Off Western Australia, 645 Australians killed. Every single man aboard. No survivors. The worst loss of life in Royal Australian Navy history. Combined. 1 ship. 2 battles. 766 total dead. A legend built and destroyed in 16 months. Collins's tactics influenced naval doctrine across 5 navies for 3 generations. His emphasis on long-range engagement saved countless lives in conflicts from Korea to the Falklands to the Persian Gulf. Sydney's loss forced changes in approach protocols that prevented similar disasters. The new procedures for verifying unidentified vessels became standard across Commonwealth navies. The Collins-class submarines commissioned in the 1990s bear his name. 6 boats. Australia's primary submarine force. A fitting tribute to a man who understood that naval power projection requires both courage and caution. And somewhere beneath the Indian Ocean, 645 men rest with their ship. Most will never be identified. Most will never receive individual graves. But they are not forgotten. Every November 19th, Australians remember them. Why this story matters. From a gunnery specialist from Victoria, with an idea that every expert rejected, to a victory that changed naval doctrine across the world. John Collins proved that conventional wisdom isn't always wise, that faster doesn't mean better, that skill and judgment can defeat superior numbers and superior speed. Then, his own ship forgot those lessons and paid the ultimate price. HMAS Sydney's story is not just about naval warfare. It's about the fragility of success, the importance of remembering why you succeeded, the danger of believing your reputation will protect you. Collins built a legend in 90 minutes at Cape Spada. Burnett destroyed it in 30 minutes off Western Australia. The difference was not courage. The difference was not equipment. The difference was decisions. If you know another story where innovation changed the course of battle, share it in the comments. Military history is full of men and women who defied convention and changed the world. Their stories deserve to be told. This is just one of hundreds of untold stories from World War II. Subscribe to discover more tales of courage, sacrifice, and innovation that shaped our world. HMAS Sydney reminds us of a simple truth. Glory and tragedy often sail on the same ship. Victory today doesn't guarantee victory tomorrow. The only way to stay legendary is to never forget what made you legendary in the first place. 645 men went to the bottom of the Indian Ocean because that truth was forgotten. Captain John Collins spent 50 years making sure it would never be forgotten again. That's the real legacy of HMAS Sydney. Not the victory at Cape Spada, not the tragedy off Western Australia, but the lesson written in the blood of 645 sailors who trusted their ship's reputation more than the principles that built it. Distance is survival. Control the engagement. Never let the enemy choose the terms of battle. And above all, never stop doing what made you successful. Because the moment you forget, the wolves start circling.